Family. There are days in the life of a people when the wind seems to pause, when the world grows strangely quiet, as though history itself is holding its breath. And on such a day, beloved, a young voice from the Sahel rose and spoke a truth that older nations had carried like a stone in their chest. It was the day Ibrahim Traoré looked into the eyes of the world and named what many Caribbean elders had whispered for decades, that Jamaica's long journey with the International Monetary Fund was not merely an economic chapter, but a wound, a weight, and a warning. For our elders who remember the 1980s, those years were not statistics. They were supermarket shelves half empty, hospital corridors dimming, and mothers wondering how to stretch a single dollar into a week of survival. So when a leader, far away yet familiar in spirit, finally spoke aloud the truth that powerful hands once buried, something old in our people stirred again. Tonight, family, we shall walk through that moment, slowly, carefully, as one. And before we begin, beloved, do remember to subscribe, so you may stand with us each time hidden truths rise to the light. Family, let us return to that morning in Dakar, when the sun rose like an ancient witness, carrying with it the weight of unspoken truths. Delegates from every corner of the continent gathered beneath the great vaulted ceiling of the Pan-African Forum, each believing they knew what the day would bring. But none of them, not even the seasoned diplomat Jean-Claude Mensa, could sense the tremor about to travel through the room. Jean-Claude, a man who had spent 4 decades navigating the corridors of international finance, leaned forward in his seat when Ibrahim Traoré approached the podium. He had heard the young leader speak before, but that morning he sensed a different fire, a slower burn rising from somewhere deep within the soil of Burkina Faso. The hall grew still, the kind of stillness that comes not from silence, but from expectation. Traoré began by speaking of sovereignty, of the right of African and Caribbean nations to breathe without permission. His voice was steady, carrying neither anger nor haste, only truth crafted with the weight of memory. And then, almost imperceptibly, he shifted. His tone lowered, his pace slowed, his gaze lifted toward the banners representing the Caribbean nations. Jamaica, he said softly. Yet every syllable struck like a drum echoing through the generations. A nation proud, talented, and rich in soul. A people whose rhythm shaped half the world. Yet even they were asked to kneel before terms that did not honor their dignity. A murmur rippled through the audience. Jean-Claude's eyebrows tightened. Beside him, the young economist Amina Khoury whispered, "He is touching a forbidden page." For decades, the relationship between Jamaica and the International Monetary Fund had been treated like a sealed vault. Economists referred to numbers, politicians referred to decisions, but very few dared to speak of the weight those decisions placed upon the backs of ordinary people. Yet here stood a leader from a distant land, naming aloud what many Jamaicans themselves had been encouraged to forget. Traoré continued, revealing that a collection of archival documents had quietly resurfaced. These papers, discovered by a research student in Ouagadougou, described not only the public conditions of Jamaica's structural adjustment programs, but also private clauses seldom acknowledged. The hall leaned in as though the walls themselves wished to hear. He spoke of directives that limited agricultural subsidies, directives that quietly opened domestic markets to heavily subsidized imports. He spoke of memoranda requiring reductions in public health and education spending. And then he spoke of a clause so chilling that even the veteran diplomat Kwame Douglas, listening from the media gallery, felt the hairs rise on his arms. A clause marked, "Not for public disclosure without prior approval." Family, the room did not gasp. No. What happened was far more powerful. A deep, collective inhale filled the hall, the kind that old folks call the breath before truth. For in that moment, older Jamaicans watching from abroad felt memories shift within them. They remembered the tightening belts, the boarded shops, the quiet fear in the eyes of their neighbors. They remembered thinking, was this truly the only way? Traoré was not accusing the Jamaican people. He was not condemning their leaders. He was simply saying aloud what many had suspected. The burden Jamaica carried was heavier than the world was ever allowed to know. And family, that sentence broke something open in the room. Amina covered her mouth. Jean-Claude shut his eyes as though recalling every negotiation table he had ever sat at. And Kwame, gripping his camera, whispered, "If he continues like this, someone will try to cut the broadcast." But Traoré was not finished. He stepped forward, voice rising only by a breath, yet enough to send a tremble through the hall. "There are nations," he said, "that have paid for their independence twice, once with their courage, and once with their silence. Silence. Heavy, sacred, unavoidable." The delegates from Mali, Ghana, and St. Lucia exchanged glances. Others bowed their heads, not in shame, but in recognition. For the truth he had spoken did not belong only to Jamaica. It belonged to every nation that had signed an agreement without the full story ever reaching their people. And then, as the cameras panned across the hall, something extraordinary happened. A single figure seated near the center aisle slowly rose to her feet. It was Marcia Ellington, a former Jamaican economic advisor, her posture trembling not with anger, but with the weight of memory pressing against her heart. Nobody expected her to speak. Nobody expected what came next. But family, it was her voice, not Traoré's, that sent shockwaves through the Caribbean and across the Atlantic. For what Marcia Ellington said in that moment would ignite a fire no government, no institution, and no silent archive could ever again contain: family. When Marcia Ellington rose to her feet, the hall seemed to lean towards her, as though every beam and every banner understood that an old silence was about to break. Marcia had served Jamaica during some of its harshest economic years, her hands ink-stained from budgets that never stretched far enough, her nights sleepless from decisions that wounded her spirit. She was not a woman known for spectacle, yet in Dakar that morning, she carried the bearing of someone who had carried truth too long. Her voice trembled at first, not from weakness, but from the weight of memory finally permitted to speak. "Brothers and sisters," she began, "when we signed those agreements, we believed we were choosing survival. But survival without dignity is a burden that never leaves the heart." The hall went still. Even the translators hesitated, letting her words breathe before echoing them into a dozen languages. She continued, describing meetings in Kingston, where government ministers, terrified of economic collapse, accepted conditions they privately feared. Hospitals were instructed to reduce procurement. Agricultural cooperatives lost support. Civil servants faced abrupt wage restraints. And while public statements spoke of necessary reform, internal memoranda warned that public frustration would be severe. Kwame Douglas, recording from the media gallery, felt a sickness in his chest. He remembered his mother counting coins in Halfway Tree Market, trying to stretch them through the week. He remembered the day the bakery closed, the day his father lost work, the day the street vendor disappeared. All the memories he had carried quietly now returned with a pulse. Marcia's voice grew stronger. "We did not tell the people everything. That is the truth I carry. Not because we wished to mislead them, but because we were told that transparency would undermine stability. We believed obedience was the only door left open. A soft cry rose from the Jamaican delegation. Some lowered their heads. Others stared straight ahead, unblinking, as though seeing their own pasts reframed by a single confession. Then, family, something more dramatic occurred. The Caribbean Broadcasting Network, which had been streaming the event live, abruptly cut the feed. Screens in Kingston, Port of Spain, Bridgetown, and Castries flickered to black. A banner appeared, temporary technical interruption. But the interruption, beloved, was no accident. It was a hand reaching across oceans to pull a curtain over truth. Yet truth, once spoken aloud, is like water. It finds its way. Kwame immediately lifted his phone, switching to a private livestream. "If they cut the cameras," he whispered, voice trembling, "then we shall become the cameras." Within minutes, tens of thousands across the Caribbean tuned in. Amina Khoury watched from her seat, tears clinging to her eyelashes. "This is no longer a conference," she said softly. "This is history reopening its pages." And then came the moment that truly shook the hall. Ibrahim Traoré stepped forward, turning towards Marcia with a gaze full of respect. "My sister," he said, "you carried this alone for too long. But a people cannot heal from what they do not name." A hush fell. He addressed the broader assembly. "If a policy cannot survive the light of day, then perhaps it should never have been imposed. And if a nation is told to stay silent, then its suffering will become a harvest for someone else." Some delegates applauded. Others shifted uneasily, glancing towards the diplomatic observers from Europe and North America. The tension was no longer a murmur. It was a storm gathering its breath. A senior official from an international financial institution scribbled notes so urgently that his pen snapped. Another whispered into a phone, face pale, as though trying to contain an unfolding narrative already beyond his grasp. Then Jean-Claude Mensa rose, adding his seasoned voice to the rising tide. "For decades," he said, "we taught our people that austerity was the price of order. But perhaps we forgot to ask who benefited from that order." His statement sparked a wave of murmurs. Delegates who once feared speaking now felt emboldened. The core of the room shifted from listening to awakening. Yet amid that rising courage, a rumor began to circulate. A rumor that someone in Kingston, panicked by Marcia's testimony, had contacted the embassy requesting intervention. A rumor that documents from Jamaica's archives documents, long believed sealed, might soon be leaked. Kwame's phone buzzed. A message flashed. "Check your email immediately. Something big." He opened it. There, attached without explanation, was a scanned document bearing the seal of the Jamaican Ministry of Finance. It outlined confidential notes from a negotiation session decades earlier. Notes that, if genuine, would prove that the burden placed upon Jamaica had been heavier, sharper, and more politically manipulated than anyone inside Dakar yet realized. Kwame's breath caught. Amina leaned over. "What is it?" he whispered. "If this is real, everything we thought we knew is only half the story. For within that leaked document lay a truth capable of shaking Jamaica, the Caribbean, and every nation that once bowed under the same weight. A truth the world was never meant to see." Family, when Kwame Douglas opened the scanned document on his trembling phone, he felt the air thicken around him. It was as though the hall itself paused, waiting for truth to reveal its full weight. The file was old, the ink slightly faded, yet the words carried a sharpness untouched by time. Amina Khoury leaned closer, reading over his shoulder, as though afraid the words might vanish if she blinked. At the top of the page, confidential consultation. Meeting between the International Monetary Fund and the Ministry of Finance, Jamaica, 1981. Below it, handwritten notes in the familiar script of the late Sir Donovan read. Kwame gasped. Donovan had been revered as one of Jamaica's sharpest economic minds, a man who had carried the island's hope through impossible storms. To see his private words now felt like entering a room he had locked decades ago. The document revealed something never spoken publicly. It described enhanced supervisory oversight, a phrase that sounded harmless until one read its explanation. The International Monetary Fund reserved the right to intervene directly in Jamaica's budgetary schedule if the government deviated from the agreed path. Amina covered her mouth. This was not partnership. This was a leash. Further down, Donovan had noted, requirement accepted under economic duress, political backlash expected, public disclosure not advisable at this stage. Family, those words burned, not because they accused Jamaica's leaders of betrayal, but because they exposed the crushing pressure under which decisions had been made. Jamaica had been negotiating with empty pockets, shrinking reserves, and a population desperate for relief. Survival had demanded sacrifice, but that sacrifice had come at a cost generations would continue to carry. Kwame scrolled further. A section outlined a proposed scaling back of agricultural cooperatives, including a warning that international imports, subsidized elsewhere, would outcompete local farmers. In other words, Jamaica's economy had been asked to open its windows during a storm. The result was inevitable. Local industries weakened, farmers abandoned fields, and communities that once fed themselves became dependent on foreign markets. Then Kwame reached the line that made his hands shake. Opposition should be managed through controlled communication. Messaging must emphasize responsibility and inevitability. Amina whispered, "This explains everything." The silence, the confusion, the sense that something invisible was shaping our lives. And family, it was in that moment that the hall felt a shift, subtle, yet powerful. Delegates who had once doubted now understood. Elders watching the unofficial livestream began writing in the comments. So we were not imagining it. We felt the weight because the weight was real. This revelation was more than economic history. It was a reckoning. Across Dakar, word of the leaked file spread like fire through dry grass. Jean-Claude Mensah, the veteran diplomat, requested to speak next. His voice, softened by age yet sharpened by conviction, rose from his seat. For years, he said, we told our nations that these hardships were necessary, that they were the only path to progress. But progress that demands the weakening of a people's dignity is not progress. It is surrender disguised as strategy. Marcia Ellington, now seated, wiped her eyes. She understood the burden of responsibility Jean-Claude carried. She had carried her own version of it for decades. The tragedy was not corruption or malice. It was desperation, the kind that corners leaders into choosing between bad and worse. Yet amid the sorrow, a strange, rising clarity began to form, a clarity the world would later call an Ibrahim Traoré moment. The instant when a leader's courage forces history to reopen, allowing nations to see themselves with new eyes. Family, that is what shook people across the Caribbean and the African diaspora. It was not merely the exposure of old documents. It was the sudden realization that their suffering had context. Their pain had architecture. Their memory had been accurate all along. In Kingston, emotions surged. Some were furious, realizing that generations had paid a price they never fully understood. Others felt deep regret, imagining what Jamaica might have become if its hands had not been tied. Older Jamaicans, who had long blamed themselves for economic decline, began to whisper, perhaps we were not the failure. Perhaps we were failed. At the same time, hope flickered. If truth could resurface after 40 years, perhaps dignity could return as well. Perhaps the next generation free from silence could choose a different path. But family, truth, once revealed, rarely sits quietly. It stirs the waters. It demands response. It forces powerful hands to move. And far away, in Washington, those hands had already begun to tremble. For the shock of Dakar did not end in Africa or the Caribbean. The greatest ripple was about to strike the United States itself. Family, if Jamaica had known the full weight of those conditions from the beginning, how do you believe its destiny might have unfolded? Share your thoughts below. Family, when the truth from Dakar began to cross the Atlantic, it was Kwame Douglas who first sensed the shift. His phone, still warm from the leaked document, vibrated with messages pouring in from Washington, Atlanta, Baltimore, and Chicago. Elders of the African diaspora wrote with a trembling mixture of anger and recognition. "We lived versions of this," one brother typed. "Different soil, same storm." For decades, American policymakers had spoken of Jamaica's struggles as the consequence of mismanagement, never acknowledging the invisible scaffolding that shaped those outcomes. But now, as Kwame's livestream reached living rooms from Brooklyn to Birmingham, that old narrative began to fracture. Amina Khoury, sitting beside him, watched the unfolding reaction with quiet sorrow. She understood the language of think tanks and diplomatic statements, and she recognized the tone of panic beginning to rise. In Washington, memos circulated with phrases like "contain the narrative" and "prepare a unified response." The system, long accustomed to managing perception, now faced a truth too large to fold neatly into silence. Then came a statement from an unexpected voice. Congresswoman Helena Atkins, a descendant of Caribbean migrants and a longtime advocate for economic justice. She stood before the press and said, "If these documents are authentic, then Jamaica's suffering was not simply economic hardship. It was structured adversity, and structured adversity demands accountability." Her words rippled across American media, forcing commentators to address what many had avoided for years. Meanwhile, in the wider world, Sir Donovan Reed's resurfaced notes traveled further than he ever imagined. In Accra, students at the National University pored over the scanned pages during late-night study circles. In Port of Spain, activists held impromptu town hall meetings. In London, Caribbean community elders revisited memories long buried beneath resignation. International institutions responded with a familiar blend of caution and deflection. Carefully worded statements emphasized context, complexity, and historical difficulty. Yet none denied the authenticity of the memoranda. That silence spoke louder than any press release. Jean-Claude Mensa, seasoned by decades of witnessing diplomatic storms, felt an ache in his chest. "This is not merely an economic matter," he murmured. "This is the soul of a people remembering itself." For he knew that when nations begin to reclaim their story, the balance of power subtly shifts. Marcia Ellington, watching the reactions unfold, felt both grief and relief wash over her. She had carried her truth for so long that sharing it felt like stepping into a new life. But she also understood that revelation alone is never enough. A nation needs direction, renewal, a path forward after the wound has been named. And family, that question, what Jamaica should do next, began rising everywhere, from classrooms to kitchens, from parliament to the diaspora. But the world had not yet heard the clearest call. For amid the noise of outrage and the stirrings of hope, a new conversation was preparing to emerge that would look not backward, but forward. For the next debate, family, was not about blame, but about destiny. What path should Jamaica walk now that truth has returned to the surface? Family, when the dust began to settle after Dakar, it was Kwame Douglas who first sensed that the Caribbean was no longer whispering. It was speaking. Street-side vendors in Kingston debated the leaked notes as though they were reading scripture. Taxi drivers quoted Marsha Ellington's trembling confession word for word. Elders, who had lived through the tightening fists of austerity, leaned forward in their chairs as though hearing their own stories returned to them after 4 decades of exile. And beneath all that rising memory, a new question beat like a drum. What now? Amina Khoury was among the first to propose a direction. She argued that Jamaica must reclaim its economic voice by building fresh alliances not rooted in dependency, but in mutual dignity. She envisioned a South-South partnership between the Caribbean and the Sahel, a coalition grounded in shared histories of resilience and shared determination to never again allow outsiders to script their future. Others joined the conversation. Former advisor Sir Donovan Reid, whose handwritten notes had become the spark of this awakening, offered his own sober counsel. Jamaica must begin by restoring its internal pillars, its farmers, its educators, its nurses, its civil servants. A nation cannot negotiate from strength, he warned, if the hands of its people are still tied. Jean-Claude Mensah spoke next, urging Jamaica to use this moment not to reopen old wounds, but to redefine its place in the world. Every great nation, he said, must one day confront the chapter it was told not to read. Jamaica has now opened that chapter. The next step is to write the page that comes after, and Marsha, who had carried her truth like a stone through decades of silence, offered the most unexpected voice of all. She called for renewal not through anger, but through remembrance. She proposed a national forum, inviting elders and youth alike to reclaim the narrative of their country's economic journey. A people who understand their past, she said softly, cannot be misled in their future. Family, hope began to flicker in places where despair once lived. Younger Jamaicans who had grown up hearing only fragments of the story now felt connected to a larger arc. Diaspora communities in New York and London spoke of investing in new Jamaican enterprises. Caribbean scholars drafted proposals for a regional development bank, insulated from external political pressures. Musicians wrote songs calling the nation to rise again. But amid this fresh wind of possibility, one truth remained clear. Every path forward would require courage. Courage to build again. Courage to trust again. Courage to walk away from narratives that once defined Jamaica as small, fragile, or dependent. And family, that courage was beginning to bloom. For the final question, the one only the Jamaican people themselves can answer, waits in the closing message. What future shall this nation claim now that truth has finally returned to its hands? Family, as the echoes of Dakar settle into memory, Kwame Douglas stands by a quiet window in Kingston, watching the evening light settle over the city. For the first time in many years, he feels that Jamaica is not merely reacting to the world, but awakening to itself. The truth has returned, not as an accusation, but as a lantern carried into a long, dark corridor. Amina Khoury reflects on the journey, whispering that every nation must one day reclaim its stolen chapters. Jamaica has done precisely that. And in doing so, it has become part of something larger than policy or politics. It has stepped into an Ibrahim Traoré moment, a point in history when truth is no longer content to live in the shadows. Sir Donovan Reid, whose old notes shook the region, now finds comfort in knowing that his word, Sons locked in an archive have begun to heal rather than divide. He reminds the nation that understanding is not the end of the journey. It is the first stone laid for the path that comes next. Jean-Claude Mensah watches this unfolding with the experienced patience of a man who has witnessed many eras rise and fall. Yet even he admits that moments like this do not come often. He calls it the second Ibrahim Traoré moment, not because of politics, but because ordinary people have rediscovered the power of asking. Why were we told to stay silent? And who benefited from that silence? And Marcia Ellington, whose trembling voice in Dakar cracked open the sealed vault of history, now walks with lighter steps. She knows the world witnessed not only her confession, but also the Ibrahim Traoré reaction that followed a reaction born not of anger, but of recognition. Family, truth is not merely a revelation. Truth is a beginning. Jamaica now stands at a crossroads. Ahead lies a future that must be shaped with clarity, courage, and community. Will it choose deeper alliances with Africa? Will it rebuild its industries with dignity restored? Will it teach the next generation the story that was once withheld from their parents? These questions belong not to politicians alone, but to every Jamaican heart at home and abroad. Family, what future do you believe Jamaica should claim now that the truth has finally been spoken aloud? Share your vision below. And beloved, if this journey moved you, do remember to subscribe, so our family may continue walking through the untold stories that shape our people.